mute their microphones in case you haven't done already. I'm going to welcome everyone and introduce our speaker for this morning. I will begin as usual with our land acknowledgement. To remind us that Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them and this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. CHEO also honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and their valuable past, present, and future contributions to this land. With that, I'm very pleased to present our speaker for this morning, Dr. Nicholas Kuzik, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Healthy Active Living and Obesity, otherwise known as HALO Research Group at the CHEO Research Institute. So Nicholas received his master's and PhD in the Behavioral Epidemiology Lab at the University of Alberta under the supervision of Dr. Valerie Carson. The subject of his master's thesis and PhD dissertation was movement disorders in early years in children. Nicholas moved to Ottawa to begin his postdoctoral fellowship with Marc Tremblay in the HALO Research Group at CHEO. I believe it was November 2020. He is also working part-time with Statistics Canada, where he leads a series of studies involving movement behavior measurement with accelerometers. And his title for his presentation this morning is 24-Hour Movement Behaviors, Paradigm Shift, and Future Directions. So Nicholas, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this. I will remind everybody that Wi-Fi may be an issue, so please bear with if there's any delays. So over to you, Nicholas.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for that introduction and land acknowledgement. I'll just share my screen now. Thumbs up. Perfect. So again, thanks a lot for the land acknowledgement and the introduction, and as well, thanks for everyone for joining on this very snowy day in Ottawa. Very excited to be here today to discuss one of my favorite topics, that being movement behaviors. I suppose I'm at home as per usual, but I'm here in spirit and excited just the same. And it's always a good day when there's an occasion to change out of my sweatsuit, at least the top half. And to begin, I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And as mentioned, today I'm going to be discussing movement behaviors. And the two specific objectives are to first understand what movement behaviors are and how they're integrated or codependent. And then we're going to move on to discussing the challenges and opportunities in examining 24-hour movement behaviors. And in doing so, we'll also demonstrate the so what of movement behaviors based on their associations with health outcomes and prevalence levels. So starting first with, what are movement behaviors? This term movement behaviors is an umbrella term encapsulating sleep, sedentary behavior, and physical activity. And we can think about movement behaviors on an intensity continuum from little or no movement during sleep and sedentary behavior to high levels of movement during vigorous physical activity. And something of great importance is this idea that the classifications of movement behaviors can be considered codependent. When we think about our available time in a 24-hour day, we can categorize movement behaviors such that all time is spent engaged to either sleep, sedentary behavior, or physical activity. And that makes these behaviors mutually exclusive and exhaustive of a 24-hour day. So if we reduce one movement behavior, for instance, I don't know, you spend an extra hour on Saturday making sure your slides are looking good, or an extra hour sedentary, then you need to compensate by reducing your sleep or physical activity in that given 24-hour period. And the idea of looking at sleep, sedentary behavior, and physical activity in a 24-hour day may seem intuitive, but the areas of research have a history of being studied in isolation. So starting with Morris in 1953 examining physical activity epidemiology, then Bixler in 1979 studying sleep epidemiology. In 2000, Owen made the distinction that sedentary behavior and physical activity were two separate constructs. Then, 2007, CHEO's own Marc Tremblay suggested that the three behaviors should be examined together. And we'll come back to this figure to touch on some of the later items, but the main takeaway for now was that the study of these behaviors developed in isolation. So further, as CHEO's J.P. Chapu pointed out in 2014 when arguing that the three behaviors should be examined together, even the physical activity literature is mainly focused on the health benefits of moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity, or MVPA. While it's undoubtedly true that MVPA is a very beneficial behavior, when we think about a 24-hour day, only a small percentage of time is spent in MVPA. The majority of our waking day is spent sedentary or engaged in light intensity physical activity. And it would be unrealistic to assume we could spend all of our waking hours engaged in MVPA. For instance, that time spent sedentary is needed to finish putting together a slideshow on a Saturday, and we can't just be out cross-country skiing or sledding all day. And ultimately, what CHEO and colleagues were arguing for was a paradigm that integrates these behaviors, instead of the traditional approach of treating these behaviors as isolated incidents. Okay, so we know what movement behaviors are and why conceptually they should be examined together. But what are the ways we can examine the relationships between movement behaviors and health? And it's a bit of an oversimplification, but for our purposes today, we're going to consider two main ways, that being guideline adherence and compositional data analyses. And before we look at any actual adherence to guidelines, let's take a step back and look at how the guidelines were created, with an emphasis on the integrated movement behavior reviews and recommendations. So this is also a good time to take a look at our movement behavior timeline. And as we can see, in 2016, Mark Tremblay and colleagues developed the first public health guidelines that included recommendations for all movement behaviors. And this is a photo of the team responsible for developing those guidelines, taken August 2015. And during my master's degree, I was fortunate enough to contribute in a small role through screening articles in one of the systematic reviews. In fact, I traveled to this meeting the day after defending my master's degree. And I even made the photo. Now, I should say in this little highlighted section, I'm the one at the top, not the bottom. And you can tell from the glasses, that's the dead giveaway. And with my supervisor at the time, who was one of the project principal investigators, Dr. Valerie Carson from the University of Alberta, who is also considered a HALO affiliate investigator. And the two other project principal investigators, CHEO and HALO's very own Drs. Mark Tremblay and JP Chaput, with Mark serving as chair on this project. Now, as I alluded to, part of the guideline development process involved conducting a series of systematic reviews. So the guidelines are based on the best available evidence. The reviews I will focus on for today are the integrated movement behavior reviews. For school-age children and youth, it was found that ideal combinations of movement behaviors being adequate sleep, more physical activity, and less sedentary behavior. And they were associated with many health outcomes. And this included adiposity, cardiometabolic health outcomes such as fasting insulin, triglycerides, blood pressure, and overall metabolic syndrome scores. And lastly, there were benefits to fitness outcomes. And additionally, there was a pattern of the most benefits for health occurring when replacing sedentary behavior with MVPA. Again, the main emphasis today is on the integrated pieces, but I'm going to go over the guidelines in their totality for context. So the guidelines are broken into categories of sweat on the far left in green, moving right to step in orange, sleep in purple, and sit in blue. And for sweat, it is recommended that children and youth accumulate at least 60 minutes of MVPA, as well as VPA and muscle and bone strengthening activities at least 3 times per week. For step, several hours of light intensity physical activity are recommended per day. For sleep, 9 to 11 hours of uninterrupted sleep for 5 to 13-year-olds, and 8 to 10 hours per night for those aged 14 to 17 years. Lastly, for sit, no more than 2 hours per day of recreational screen time is recommended, as well as limiting extended periods of sitting. And looking at the messaging based on the integrated movement behavior review, the recommendations state that preserving sufficient sleep, trading indoor time for outdoor time, and replacing sedentary behaviors and light physical activity with additional moderate to vigorous physical activity can provide greater health benefits. Now we're going to move on to the guidelines for the early years. And I was very fortunate to be invited to the leadership committee on this project based on the work I'd been conducting on the topic of integrated movement behaviors in my master's thesis and PhD dissertation. Again, for this review, ideal combinations were operationally defined as adequate sleep, more physical activity, and less sedentary behavior. And with that definition in mind, ideal combinations of physical activity and sedentary behavior were favorably associated with motor development, fitness, and adiposity in preschool age children, as well as adiposity alone for toddlers. And we saw ideal combinations of sleep and sedentary behavior were associated with lower adiposity in infants and toddlers. Now, for the early years, recommendations were made for infants or children less than 1 year, toddlers or children 1 to 2 years of age, and preschoolers or children 3 to 4 years of age. And we won't get too in depth on the specific recommendations, but I encourage you to investigate if you are interested. But I'll spend time on going over some of the key points. So first, in these guidelines, the sweat and step recommendations we saw for children and youth have been collapsed into a move category, as there is at times no specific recommendations for moderate or intense levels of physical activity. So for instance, for infants, the type of move or physical activity that we are interested in is tummy time, of which it is recommended for infants to get at least 30 minutes per day spread out over the day. For sleep, the recommended duration of sleep, or ranges of durations, is the highest in the youngest children and generally decreases as children get older. So even within the infant category, the range is 14 to 17 hours for children aged 0 to 3 months and 12 to 16 hours for children aged 4 to 11 months. And the same pattern can be seen for naps. So infants have fractured sleep and need naps, but as children get older, they have more consolidated nighttime sleep and subsequently less reliance on daytime sleep. And the recommendations for sit to be restrained from no more than 1 hour is consistent across all age groups, but there are some differences for sedentary screen time. So starting with the infants, where screen time is not recommended. So looking now at toddlers, it's recommended 180 minutes of total physical activity at any intensity for move. Again, seeing less sleep needs as children get older, with 11 to 14 hours of sleep recommended. And for sedentary screen time, again, is not recommended for children younger than 2 years. But for children aged 2 years, it is recommended that they accumulate no more than 1 hour of sedentary screen time per day. Finally, for preschool age children, the 180 minutes of total physical activity remains, but the additional recommendation is 60 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity. Again, sleep needs decreasing, with 10 to 13 hours recommended for preschool age children. As well, the recommendation for sit is no more than 1 hour of sedentary screen time per day. Now, for the moment everyone's been waiting for, the edge of their seats, what messaging was developed based on the review Dr. Kuzik, at the time Mr. Kuzik, led, and obviously weaved together with expert opinion and stakeholder feedback? Well, let me tell you, it was recommended that replacing time restrained or sedentary screen time with additional energetic play and trading indoor for outdoor time while preserving sufficient sleep can provide greater health benefits. Now that we know what the guidelines are, you may be asking yourself, so what? Well, fortunately, a systematic review recently came out of HALO from Rollo and colleagues. And one of the main findings from this review was that meeting all 24-hour movement guideline recommendations was associated with a plethora of health and well-being indicators, from social and emotional cognitive development in preschool age children, health-related quality of life in children, and mental, social, emotional, and cardiometabolic health in children and youth. So we have this set of behaviors, and they're associated with a mass of health and well-being indicators. But alarmingly, the levels of guideline adherence in Canada are quite low. So the Canadian Health Measures Survey is a national data set collected by Statistics Canada with a host of health measures. And it is our national surveillance measure of movement behaviors. My dog's yowling in the background, if anyone heard that. And it's our national surveillance measure of movement behaviors. So according to the CHMS, about 13% of preschool age children are meeting all of the recommendations. 18% of children and youth, broken down into 30% of children and 6% of youth. So quite a low amount of children are meeting these recommendations and possibly at risk for adverse health outcomes and lack of development. So before I move on from guideline adherence, I think it's only fair to mention that a new set of guidelines has come out for adults. And this presentation is geared towards children, so I won't get too in-depth into it, but it still is worth mentioning that stellar work being done by Mark Tremblay and JP Choupeau as leaders on this project as well. And since we're all adults here, I'm assuming you should know for your own health that it's recommended to accumulate 150 minutes per week of MVPA with muscle strengthening activities at least twice per week. Several hours of light activities, including standing, 7 to 9 hours of sleep per day, and limiting sedentary time to 8 hours a day or less, including no more than 3 hours of recreational screen time. Okay, So now we talked about guideline adherence as one way of examining integrated relationships between movement behaviors and health indicators. So let's explore compositional analyses. Now, consider for a second a linear regression model. If we measure sleep, sedentary time, and physical activity with an accelerometer, and we wanted to examine the associations between those movement behaviors as the exposure variables with cardiovascular disease as our outcome variable, our models will be full of problems. So these problems stem from the perfect multicollinearity between the movement behavior variables. And this perfect multicollinearity arises because, as mentioned, these variables are mutually exclusive and exhaustive of a 24-hour day. So think about it conceptually, moving away from multicollinearity. So if a coefficient in a regression analysis represents the change in an outcome variable, when we change that exposure variable by 1 unit while holding all other exposure variables constant, if our base unit for movement behaviors is in hours, then a change in 1 unit creates impossible days with either 25 or 23 hours per day. While it's impossible, or it's a constant attack of daylight savings. It's one of the two. Either way, it creates these unrealistic situations within our data. So one workaround that we just discussed is to create these categories of time, such as the guideline adherence approach, where we can classify our sample into groups of meeting or not meeting guidelines and see the effect of health outcomes. But how do we look at this data using continuous values? Fortunately, in 2015, Chaston and colleagues introduced a branch of statistics to our area called compositional analysis. And this was originally developed in the field of geology to analyze the composition of sediments. Subsequently, in 2017, Dorothea Demoids started introducing techniques that vastly improved the interpretation of this wizard math. More specifically, in 2015, a technique was introduced, and studies could generally say that the composition of all movement behaviors was favorable or unfavorable, sort of an on-off switch of yes, these compositions matter, or no, they do not. And while it was exciting to analyze all these behaviors together without breaking the model, the interpretation of results was somewhat meaningless. But in 2017, substitution analysis were introduced, and it was possible to examine the effects of substituting one behavior for another, such as 30 minutes of sedentary time exchanged for 30 minutes of MVPA within your statistical models. So this vastly helped explain why your results matter and that interpretation piece. Now, not on this timeline, but at the very end, I'm going to explain compositional analyses. The last thing I'll show you is the latest evolution in this area. And so we can determine the ideal distribution of behaviors in a day. Or you can think of it as a web of substitutions that are performed until whatever health outcome we're examining is optimized. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. What this technique is at its core is a way to analyze compositional data, or data with strictly positive components that carry relative information. So thinking about relative versus absolute data in our case, hours is an absolute unit, but hours per day is a relative unit, or hours is essentially meaningless unless we have a frame of reference such as hours per day, hours per week, hours per month, hours per lifetime. And I'll spare everyone a worked example, but for those interested, the crux of this technique is the transformation of data into log ratio coordinates. In this case that I have up here, it's isometric log ratio coordinates. So instead of a worked example in transformations, I have one of my favorite examples to demonstrate the importance of composition analyses. Now, consider a linear regression model examining the influence of movement behaviors on BMI Z scores. And we have 4 models created to prevent the singularity. 1 behavior is removed from each model. So in model 1, we remove sleep. Model 2, sedentary time. Model 3, we remove light physical activity. And model 4, we remove MVPA. If we look at all of these beta values, all of these associations are significant, so that doesn't change. But we do see a slight change in MVPA as coefficients range from negative 0.01 to negative 0.02. But overall, MVPA is associated with a decrease in BMI Z score, so the trend remains the same. But depending on what movement behavior is emitted from the model, sedentary time is associated with both a decrease and an increase in BMI Z score. So we're getting different results. And the same can be said for sleep. Thus, simply excluding a behavior from the analysis could end up producing spurious results. And this approach is a very common practice prior to the introduction of compositional analyses in our area of research. So looking back at the review from Rollo and colleagues, they also summarized the evidence for studies using compositional analyses. Again, we're seeing a number of health benefits for the composition of movement behaviors, from bone and skeletal health in preschoolers, health-related quality of life for children, and mental, social, and emotional health in children and youth. As well, we can see that for all children, the composition of movement behavior is beneficial for children's adiposity. So just to finish things off today, I wanted to go through 2 examples of compositional analyses. So I mentioned in 2015, we were able to determine if movement behaviors were favorable or unfavorable. So that's that first, movement behaviors, good or bad. And the next step was looking at these substitutions. So this is a study from my dissertation looking at compositional substitutions, specifically looking at movement behaviors and physical, cognitive, and social emotional development of preschool-age children. To give a bit of context, the early years are broadly defined as ages 0 to 5 years of age in this study, and a period of time marked with rapid growth and development. Furthermore, this rapid growth and development is sensitive to external stimulus, such as levels of movement behaviors, including sleep, sedentary behavior, and physical activity, making this a critical age for development. While movement behaviors have shown importance to children's development in isolation, few studies had considered all movement behaviors in this age group prior to this study. Further, of the studies examining all movement behaviors, most studies examined physical development or adiposity and growth indicators. So to address this lack of information, my dissertation used compositional analyses to examine areas of cognitive, social, emotional, and physical development in a sample of preschool-age children. Its specifically objective of the study was to examine the effect of substituting movement behaviors on children's cognitive, social, emotional, and physical development. And as mentioned, this research was part of my dissertation, which was collected in the city of Edmonton and surrounding areas in Canada. And all recruitment was through Sportball, an organization offering programming for children ages 3 to 16 with the intention of teaching children fundamental skills for various sports through play. And through this recruitment partnership, we were able to recruit 95 children with usable data for this analysis. And children had an average age of 4.5 years, the majority of children were boys and Caucasian. And all movement behaviors were measured using the actigraph accelerometers. And the wear time protocol was set at 24 hours a day for 7 days. Again, looking at sedentary time, light physical activity, moderate to vigorous physical activity, and sleep for our movement behaviors. So to examine cognitive development, we used the iPad-based early years toolbox. And response inhibition was measured using the go or no-go task. Visual spatial working memory was measured using the Mr. Ant task. And language development was measured using the expressive vocabulary task. Another part of the early years toolbox is the child self-regulation and behavior questionnaire, which was used to assess social emotional development. While available on the iPad, we printed a paper version for the parents to complete while I administered the cognitive development tasks to the children. And through this questionnaire, we measured social ability, or the tendency and ability to engage in social situations, internalizing, or negative emotions focused inwards, such as anxiety, externalizing, or negative emotions focused outwards, such as aggression, pro-social behavior, engagement in social interactions that benefit others, and self-regulation, or the ability to limit the reaction one has to a stimulus, thus allowing the individual to not lose focus on a cognitive task, explore emotional responses beyond the first emotional reaction, and negotiate or resolve social conflicts. Lastly, we use motor skills, adiposity, and growth to represent physical development. So motor skills were measured using the Test of Gross Motor Development 2 task and included summaries for locomotor, object motor, and total motor skills. Adiposity was assessed with body mass index Z scores. And this required measuring children's height and weight with a stadiometer and digital scale, then applying the World Health Organization standards to calculate Z scores. And lastly, growth was represented by the child's percent of expected adult height. So children's height were measured with stadiometer, while the height of the child's biological parents was assessed within a questionnaire. And these values were applied to the sex-specific formulas to predict the child's expected adult height, and subsequently the child's current percentage of their expected adult height. So for movement behavior descriptive information, compositional geometric means were calculated and normalized to 24 hours. Isometric log ratio transformations were applied to the movement behavior composition. Then linear regression models were created for each movement behavior and outcome measure combination. Further regression models were then built with hypothetical substitutions to the children's movement behaviors. So substitutions were for 30 minutes, since this value aligned with both the minimum amount and the lowest standard deviation of any movement behavior. Further substitutions were 1 for 1. And this means 30 minutes of one behavior was substituted for 30 minutes of another behavior. So for instance, models were created that increased MVPA by 30 minutes while decreasing light physical activity by 30 minutes to examine what changes would occur on object motor skills. For each outcome variable, bivariate regression analyses were conducted to determine which covariates should be included when examining the outcome variable in further models. And there are 15 outcome variables in total, 12 time reallocation models for each outcome. So for clarity, we decided to focus on the trends and relationships for today and defined a trend of 50% or more significant associations in each domain of interest for movement behaviors. Looking first at descriptive information, we can see that on average, children accumulate 11.1 hours per day of sleep in purple, 6.1 hours of stationary time in blue, 5.1 hours per day of light physical activity in orange, and 1.8 hours of moderate to biggest physical activity in green. Looking at the figures, each movement behavior has its own bar, breaking down the percent of relationships seen as favorable in green, unfavorable in red, and null in blue, when the behavior was added while another movement behavior was subtracted. Further, movement behaviors moving from left to right are sleep, stationary time, light physical activity, and moderate to vigorous physical activity. So for cognitive development, there's a null trend for all movement behavior substitutions. For example, adding LPA while subtracting MVPA was unfavorably associated with cognitive development, as we can see from the sliver of red in that LPA bar. But the majority of the bar is blue, meaning adding LPA showed a null trend for cognitive development overall. Likewise, there's a null trend for all movement behavior substitutions with social emotional development indicators. And while the trends for physical development indicate mainly null findings, 53% of substitutions adding MVPA were favorable, indicating a trend towards favorable relationships between MVPA substitutions and physical development. And this favorable trend of MVPA substitutions and physical development mainly results from motor skills. So in this table, we've singled out instances where MVPA was added and from left to right, sleep, stationary time, and LPA were subtracted. And the difference this made to domains of motor skills, specifically from top to bottom motor skill domains from the TGMD are locomotor skills, object motor skills, and total motor skills. And from that, we see that all MVPA substitutions were favorable, except the null association when adding MVPA and subtracting stationary time. And just working with one example, on the far left, when adding 30 minutes of MVPA are added while subtracting 30 minutes of LPA, the result in an additional 3.28 points for locomotor skills and 3.99 points for object motor skills. And with our sample mean being 4.5 years, this would mean going from the 37th percentile to the 50th percentile of locomotor skill scores. And for object motor skills, going from the 37th percentile to the 50th percentile for boys, or 37th percentile to the 63rd percentile for girls. Thus, we could say that substituting MVPA for other movement behaviors is beneficial to physical development. And this is mainly due to the benefits to motor skills. And obviously, these results need to be considered in conjunction with questions of generalizability of those results. So this was cross-sectional, it was a convenient sample with less than 100 children, and the levels of MVPA seem to be higher than the national average. So these children may not be representative of the broader Canadian population. Okay, so on to the last example. So as I said, we just looked at that movement behavior substitutions in terms of the compositional data analysis evolution. And now we're going to look at the best day. And I think this is what I'm most excited about right now. Specifically, I'm going to go through a presentation we gave at a conference last summer applying compositional analyses to the PED-CARE data set in the pursuit of the ideal timing and distribution of movement behaviors for post-concussion symptoms. And to start, traditional protocols for pediatric concussion management prescribe rest until asymptomatic, then a resumption of physical activity, while newer recommendations prescribe resting for a period of 24 to 48 hours before gradual resumption of physical activity. However, limited evidence exists on the ideal balance between rest and exertion. Thus, this study sought to determine the ideal timing and distribution of movement behaviors for post-concussion symptoms using compositional analyses. And this presentation was a secondary analysis of the PED-CARE study, which was led by CHEO's Andréan Ledoux, Roger Zemek, and Marc Tremblay. And PED-CARE was a multi-center randomized controlled trial in Canada that recruited children ages 10 to 17.99 with an acute concussion. And children self-reported post-concussion symptoms at baseline and 2 weeks, using the health and behavior inventory, which includes the domains of cognitive and somatic post-concussion symptoms. And children's movement behaviors were measured using the CHEO accelerometers, worn 24 hours per day for 13 days, and categorized into MVPA, LPA, sedentary time, and sleep. And the compositional analyses in question included robust regression models created for the outcome variables of cognitive and somatic post-concussion symptoms, while the exposure variables were isometric log ratio transformed movement behavior compositions, while controlling for the covariates of age and sex. So each day of accelerometer wear was individually examined, so that being days 1 to 13. And when a significant day was identified, changes to outcome variables were predicted using a 1 standard deviation range of substitutions for each movement behavior. Then the substitutions that yielded the top 5% of predicted outcomes were isolated to calculate the ideal distribution of movement behaviors for that day based on the geometric mean and bootstrap 95% confidence intervals. So put another way, we first determined on which days the composition of movement behaviors were associated with post-concussion symptoms. So we flagged that day. Then for those significant days, we determined the ideal day of movement behaviors by creating a web of substitutions that took the top 5% of predicted outcome values to determine what the ideal day of movement behaviors looked like. So 2 days were identified as significant for post-concussion symptoms, that being day 6 and day 13. So looking first at day 6, on the right, we have the 3D image with the ideal distribution of movement behaviors and cognitive post-concussion symptoms in orange, somatic post-concussion symptoms in purple, and the overlap in these areas in green. And the ideal day for day 6 included about 9 hours of sleep, 10 hours of stationary time, 4 hours of LPA, and a little over 1 hour of MVPA. And over the 2-week period, this ideal distribution was associated with a decrease in post-concussion symptoms by about 2 units for cognitive and 1.5 units for somatic, and the full scale ranging from 0 to 33 points for cognitive and 0 to 27 points for somatic. Moving on to day 13, the ideal day included about 8 hours for sleep, 10 hours for stationary time, 4.5 hours for LPA, and again, just over 1 hour for MVPA. And we're seeing similar effects with a decrease by about 1.5 units for both cognitive and somatic. This is generally the point where I pause and look at my beautiful 3D figure that I'm so proud of, but I'll move on for time. And just to compare this mean movement behaviors across the 13 days, we see that on average, around 10.5 hours of sleep, 10 hours of stationary time, 3.5 hours of LPA, and half an hour of MVPA. Again, that's the average across those 13 days as compared to the ideal days we just looked at. So based off of these results, we could say that the ideal days of post-concussion symptoms have more MVPA and less sleep compared to the group average across all days. And of course, this is only for days 6 and 13 in our sample, so those 2 significant days. And while beyond the scope of what I've presented here today, we should examine the longitudinal associations across these days. And this is something that we're looking into right now as a possible solution to try and figure out how they connect. And specifically, while we saw isolated ideal days in this analysis, it could build better post-concussion recommendations if we could determine the patterns between days that were ideal. So how does it look across those 13 days for the ideal post-concussion symptoms? So looking back at our objectives, I hope that it's clear that movement behaviors are mutually exclusive and exhaustive, creating collinearity. But also beyond the closed geometry of a 24-hour day, interactions exist between behaviors, such as getting a good night's sleep preparing you to be more active and less sedentary the next day. As well, the 2 common approaches to examine 24-hour movement behaviors include guideline adherence, for which Canada and CHEO are world leaders in the domain of 24-hour movement behavior guideline development, and the compositional approach, which was recently evolved into determining the ideal distribution of movement behaviors for health outcomes, which I hope will build a strong base of evidence for what the best day of movement behaviors looks like when the next iterations of movement behavior guidelines are being developed. So thank you again for your time. It's very much appreciated. And
All right, thank you, Nicholas. That was a fantastic presentation. Some pretty exciting findings there, and love the 3D image. That was that really brought it to life. You've left us with some good time for questions, so I'm going to open it up. We got some applause for you from Mark there. I'm going to open it up to questions from the group. So if you want to pose a question to Nicholas, please either raise your hand or turn off your mic. I know that you're there. And I'm going to start off with a question for you. In that last set of data that you presented about the post-concussion studies, were the amounts of time, was it an association with the cognitive and somatic symptoms, or were those an effect of it? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, and I think that's why we were interested in pursuing the longitudinal aspects of it, because at this time we couldn't really say, because it was all just those little cross sections of the day. So for instance, if we think about why less sleep is ideal, it could be that it's a reflection of those with worse symptoms just tend to need more sleep. So by looking sort of the next evolution on the evolution, if we start to look at that day by day micro longitudinal analysis, then we might be able to get a better sense of which is leading which.
Okay, yeah, I would think that if they had a good sleep or if they had good activity, they might have better sleep, and vice versa. There are lots of associations there, aren't there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. Scan. I think perhaps what people are thinking about, I certainly am thinking about it when you present the data, when you present the guidelines in our world of Zoom now, with very little movement with in-person meetings. There's a lot of sedentary behavior that we're all part of, children and adults, and wondered if you wanted to make a comment about that, and then we can turn it over to Mark, who has his hand up.
Yeah, and I think that's, I haven't necessarily done much work on COVID. I know Mark has done quite a bit, but it is challenging times. I mean, you're missing out on active transportation potentially from work, and for children, you know, things are changing quite rapidly, going from online learning to in-person learning. So there's a lot of challenges with disruption of even, you know, your behaviors, your habits, right? But I think Mark would probably have more to say on what specifically is going on. What are some ways to address that? As I haven't really done much in the COVID sphere. It's a good question. Thank you.
That's fair. That's fair. Okay, over to you, Mark.
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation, Corey. Really good. Lots of stuff there, I think, for people to digest if they're not in this area. But and just Mona, there is a question in the chat as well for when I'm done. But I wanted to make a shameless plug. Dr. Scott Rollo, another postdoc in our group, published a paper during this presentation. It got released at 8:30 this morning. The first paper that has examined the proportion of Canadian adults meeting the guidelines based on the Canadian Health Measures Survey data. So that was published in Health Reports this morning based on StatsCan data. And so just FYI, all of us adults here, 1 in 5 of us meet none of the guidelines. So that's pretty sad. And less than 8% meet all of the guidelines. You know, these basic healthy living guidelines, you know, just eat well, move well, sleep well, you know, so there's room for improvement. And I know that's a big challenge. And to Mona's point or question about during COVID, it's a particular challenge for all of us. And we have data on kids looking at the trends, the changes that have happened in 24-hour movement behaviors during COVID, and they've plummeted, of course. They've gone from about 15, 18% pre-COVID to around 3% meeting the guidelines. Almost no kids meet the guidelines during COVID. And the biggest challenge is holding them to their screen time guidelines, to no more than 2 hours of recreational screen time. So the fact that they're doing their homework and stuff on screens from home doesn't relate, although I will make another plug that the world's first school-related sedentary behavior guidelines will be released in about a month, also led by the HALO group with an international panel. So, but anyways, and additional analyses that we've done during COVID suggest that the biggest single factor in parental success in getting their kids to live healthy during the pandemic is their self-described capacity to get their kids off screens.
Right.
That drives their movement behavior, their sleep behavior, their sedentary behavior. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks, Mona.
Wow. Okay. I do want to get to the question that's in the chat, but just to follow up on that, I think all of this discussion leads so well into the whole discussion about being able to get kids back to school, because being physically at school would help so much with that, with the whole ability to actually have time with physical activity. Mark agrees with that. And I think, as we look at the arguments for, doing what we need to do to keep kids at school, I think this is a really important part of it. So thank you for bringing that to light. There is a question in the chat for you. Sorry, Nicholas, I was calling you Nicholas. I guess Corey is what you prefer. The question from Dr. Uday Chadha, one of the community pediatricians: when can a child start vigorous exercise after concussion?
Yeah, and Corey or Nicholas, one of the two. I like to confuse people. And I should say, in terms of the concussion work, if you were very curious about it, I would recommend to check out Roger or Andre Ann as they're experts in this. I'm more of have my bag of tricks and I travel around doing compositional analyses. But my understanding in terms of the vigorous intensity physical activity, we're more so trying to look at when can we reintroduce light or moderate intensity physical activity. And I'm not too sure about vigorous per se. And as well, it would obviously determined by what the symptoms were like and the severity of those symptoms over time.
Great. Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions or hands raised. Oh, okay, that's an evaluation that went into the chat. Okay, well, if there are no further questions or comments, I think we'll close here. Thank you very much, Corey, for that